Hi, welcome to Huripec Talks. My name is Sylvie Namwase from the School of Law at Makerere University in Uganda. I'm also a postdoctorate researcher at the school's Human Rights and Peace Center. This is yet another exciting episode of Huripec Talks, exploring the concept of militarization. Today's episode is entitled Reimagining Uganda's Future in the Era of Militarization. We invite you to join us as we explore how militarization and militarism are impacting citizens' agency and the accountability of state institutions in Uganda. In this episode, we will specifically examine how militarism and militarization are impacting the various formations of citizens' civic expression in Uganda, such as youth, ethnic nationalities, media, civil service, and many others. To explore this topic with me today is the distinguished Mr. Godber Tumushabe. Mr. Tumushabe is a lecturer of human rights, international law, and environmental law at the School of Law in Makerere University. He is also the founding executive director of Advocates Coalition for Development. And currently, he is an associate director at the Great Lakes Institute for Strategic Studies. Mr. Tumushabe is a renowned public intellectual committed to the study of public policy, regional peace and security in Africa's Great Lakes sub-region. Mr. Tumushabe, you're most welcome.
Very, very delighted to be with you, Sylvia, and hope to have this conversation with our listeners.
Okay. Dear listeners, before we proceed, I would like to remind you that if you are interested in research and discussions on human rights, law and peace in Uganda and East Africa, then Huripec Talks is for you. The podcast is hosted by Makerere University in Uganda and features experts and opinion leaders. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications to stay in the loop with the latest research and discussions. Now to the episode. Mr. Tumushabe, there are varied conceptualizations of militarization and militarism. Some regard the concept in relation to preparation for warfare, while others define it as a necessity to deal with emerging security challenges, yet others describe it in entirely negative terms. But whatever the approach one takes, the concept has far-reaching impacts on communities where it is enacted. In your perspective, how would you define militarism and militarization in the Ugandan context?
Yeah, so essentially we are talking about two interrelated concepts, militarism and militarization. Militarism is more conceptual and ideological. Militarization is more of the practice. At a basic conceptual level, militarism is actually a good concept because it really implies a commitment or a belief by any country that it needs to develop its military capabilities to be able to protect its sovereignty, to defend its borders, but also to aggressively use it to promote its national interests. So that's at a fairly conceptual level. That's when we talk of militarism, that's what we should be talking about. Militarization, on the other hand, is more to do with the practice of how you use the military and security forces in actual practice. Now, at that level, you can talk about militarization in terms of projecting that national interest posture, but I think in Uganda, the one of the major practices is where you see militarization of society. So, in other words, the entire society, the entire national psyche is militarized. That you see the use of military deployments or security deployments in every segment of society. So there is the theoretical bit, which I think is fairly clear and probably useful. But when it is used by to control society, then we are talking about more of militarization. And at that point, it has actually negative connotations.
Okay, Thank you for that. And in your opinion, then, how does the concept affect citizens' organizing and formations in Uganda?
Yeah, so essentially, society is about citizens and citizenship. And when we talk about democratic societies, you are talking about democracy can only be built on civic institutions, on citizen institutions. So the different citizens' formations become the building blocks or the pillars upon which democracy is built, survives and thrives. So, and in Uganda, we as society is organized in different formations. So you can think of the political society, which is organized in form of political parties. You can talk of a cultural society, which is these are citizens organized in form of cultural institutions. So the Buganda Kingdom, the Ankole Kingdom, most of the kingdom governments or kingdom regions, these are cultural institutions, and there are other micro cultures that also where citizens organize. If you think in terms of religion, Ugandans are organized around different religious institutions. You can think of demographic, where Ugandans are organized either in terms of youth organizing, women organizing, and other forms of demographic structures. You can also think of economic formations, where Ugandans are organized economically. What we used to have as cooperative movements were strong citizen organizing around economic interests and opportunities. Just to cut the story short, you can also think in terms of citizens who are organizing in terms of professional associations. So the Uganda Law Society, the Association of Engineers, or the Medical Association, these are different forms of organizing. And so society is only, civic expression can only be had when society is organized this way. The application of the concept of militarism and militarization can actually be used to demobilize many of these citizens' organizations, and therefore, in the end, you end up weakening the civic infrastructure around which democratic dispensation can be built. Secondly, to be more specific, in Uganda right now, the approach of the current regime has actually been about how do you demobilize these civic institutions or citizens' institutions. If you think about religion, you can see a very clear purpose from the current regime. You either co-opt, buy, or you even start up your own formations. By the way, there are certain religious groups, especially within the born-again movement, which you can see that they are directly connected to the regime. But then you go to institutions like the cultural institutions, you begin to see institutions that are literally sponsored by the regime, and most of the sponsored groups actually have connection to the military. So if you think of Buganda, you will see that the Sabanyara, this is a former military officer. If you go to Busoga, one of the contenders of the kingdom authority is a former military officer. So if you study each one of them, you will see that where there are cultural institutions, there is a counter force that tries to oppose what is generally accepted as the legitimate institution. So the military is used to disorganize, or the military officers are deployed to disorganize these institutions. But of course, the more important point here is that Uganda has become a very, very militarized society. You walk around yourself, the entire country, you are basically surrounded by uniformed people who are armed, but also you are surrounded by non-uniformed people who are armed. So you have the formal security institutions of state and the informal, which are some of these are security guards and the like. They are all armed to the teeth. So Uganda is like a country at war. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, what you have now is that in that kind of environment, it is difficult to have citizens' formations thrive, because you have created a culture of fear that citizens will even fear themselves. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting that you mentioned about kingdoms and formations that are based on our ethnic identities. I want to press a little bit more on the question of ethnicity, because Uganda has had some turbulent history, partly due to negative weaponization of ethnic identities. In what ways, positive or negative, do you think militarism or militarization influences ethnic identity? And can militarization or militarism anyway coexist alongside ethnic identities in Uganda?
I think, first of all, as I said, at a general level, militarism is a generally positive concept that speaks to the commitment of those who manage the state to make sure that there is a strong military that is able to promote and defend the national interests of a country. So at a basic level, the concept is very fine. At a practical level, it depends so much on the practice. So in our case, in the case of Uganda, you have a fairly militarized almost ideology and thinking, because you have a military regime. Remember that Uganda, since independence, the military has been at the core of state governance. So right from colonialism, the colonial army, the King's African Rifles, is used to suppress all forms of citizen organizing. In 1966, the post-independence army is used to attack probably the most preeminent cultural institution of Uganda, which was the kingdom, the institution of the Kabaka. In 1971, we have the army execute its first coup against Milton Obote. And then from there, it is basically military adventure through and through. And so, even when we come to the 1995 constitutional dispensation, which was supposed to be a renegotiated citizens compact, the military is placed at the center of the governance architecture that we created by having it permanently represented in parliament. And so, as when you look at the practice now, you realize that every time there are ethnic grievances, some of them are expressed in form of military power. So, if you think of Uganda and the Kayunga riots, it was the military that had to go in to quell those riots because the Kabaka was showing to be a very, very strong power center within the country. You've seen the attack on Kasese, the Kasese massacres, where the military was able to go in and destroy an entire palace, kill over 100 people, almost more than 100, I think more than 200 people, arrested and put in prison and locked up for almost more than 4 years. So that's the military in operating in this space. So, and by the way, even when you follow the elections now in this country, there are many areas like northern Uganda and eastern Uganda where the senior army officers are the main players in the electoral process. So the cultural institutions, these ethnic nationalities that should become power centers or alternative power centers to create a balance of power, are demobilized by the presence of these armed generals, because the power of what should be the power of these ethnic nationalities is actually expropriated by these military officers, who then exercise the actual power, and they are the ones who become kingmakers, even in terms of getting people's representatives.
So in that context, then, how is there any way in which we can find a balance between our ethnic identities and militarization?
I think the balance can only be found, what I call collective citizen resistance. That we as citizens, we must be able to discover our power as citizens, because you see, there is that declaration in the Constitution: power belongs to the people. But as long as we are not organized as citizens, there is no way you can exercise that power. As I said earlier, that the power of citizens, what I call citizen sovereignty, can only be exercised when citizens are organized. So, because there is a lot of imbalance of power, where power is treated towards those who control the army, the police, the intelligence, other state security institutions, the citizens must be able to organize in their different formations to be able to create that balance of power. Unless we are able to do that, I think that we will have a challenge where the oppression, the deprivation, and the frustration remains, because normally those are like the effects of a society where society is experiencing democratic reversals. People begin to become more individual. They begin to fear, so they are ruled by fear, and they begin to scatter. And most dictatorships, by the way, because I'm one of those people who believe that current regime in Uganda under President Museveni is a fairly sophisticated dictatorship that does not believe in the existence of alternative centers of power, and therefore uses the military and other security institutions to scatter any citizens that want to organize in different forms. And I think the other point that I would make is that ethnic nationalism has been projected as negative. So in other words, if you say I'm a Munyankole, or you are a Musoga, or you are a Muganda, or an Acholi, then the current regime says you are tribal. And I think the stigmatization that has been perpetuated through this narrative and then the anti-sectarian legislation is part of the problem. I think that Ugandans must understand that you can be a good Munyankole Ugandan, you can be a good Muganda Ugandan, you can be a good Iteso Ugandan, you can be a good Acholi Ugandan. So this idea that we have to apologize for our ethnic origins or ethnic orientations, I think is a no-brainer for me. I think it's a deliberate attempt to stifle citizen organizing based on nationalities. Because Uganda is a multi-nationality country, it has all these nationalities, and I think that the future of Uganda that is strong, a strong democracy, a strong economy, can only be built on these regions, because they can be centers of organizing our people to engage in civic activity. They can be centers of economic organizing. They can be centers of raising awareness. So we need to be able to, I think as Ugandans, we need to liberate ourselves that there is no crime, me saying I'm a Munyankole, or another person saying I'm a Muganda. There's no crime in that. What we've seen is that the current regime actually has instrumentalized these ethnic nationalities and then tried to traumatize them or even project them in a negative way and say, oh, you are tribal because you have said you belong to this ethnic nationality. So I think that's the point that I would want to emphasize, and we have to challenge it as citizens, because ethnicity is a legitimate form of organizing, because there are certain interests that are based on our ethnic identities.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very succinct and very, very relevant for our context. And so now moving on the question of security and citizen organization yet again. In her book, Arbitrary States, Social Control and Modern Authoritarianism in Museveni's Uganda, Rebecca Tapscott introduces the concept of institutionalized arbitrariness, where institutionalized arbitrariness is defined as a mode of governance through which the state produces a self-policing population that can be alternatively demobilized and remobilized. How would you comment on this concept with respect to militarization and community security in Uganda?
Essentially, that's where we are actually as Uganda. And it has also historical that I would say that almost every dictatorship organizes in that form, right from those of our listeners who studied European history. You will remember the common phrase that was already said about Metternich of Germany, where we used to quote, "My daughter cannot sneeze because Metternich will hear of it." That these dictatorships basically embed intelligence gathering, embed it within the society fabric, that almost everybody begins to think that one is spying on the other. You basically sow mistrust, that even within a family, you begin not to trust each other. And I think that's where we are now as a country, that because you see, we've been on a trajectory of now 60 years of independence. We've had many lots of progress, but also many missed opportunities. But at every moment in our history, whenever we have had regimes that tend towards full dictatorship, like the Idi Amin one, now the Museveni one, the way the state is organized is that they are structures that are built to be able to police the society. So when you see the regime training crime preventers, they become part of that infrastructure. The deployment of intelligence officers, because so you go in a district, you'll find there a district intelligence officer with a Gombora intelligence officer, then there are village intelligence officers, but all of these are basically spying on the people. Because in a village, you would always say, so what are you spying on? If you're not spying on the people, in most democracies, actually there are democracies where there are laws that restrict the state from spying on citizens. You have to have a court order for you to spy on a citizen of Uganda or any other, or whichever country we are talking about. But I think where we are now is that Ugandan regime now has built that infrastructure that makes everybody suspect the other. So there is self-policing. It is those same institutions and structures that have been created are the ones that are used to mobilize citizens if the regime wants certain things to be done. So you can imagine if there is a parish development model, you normally find that the chairman of NRM at the parish level there is a member of this committee. Probably the district intelligence the Gombora intelligence officer is a member of that committee. So it is that you are talking of a police state where everything is about policing how the communities and the people operate and do their business.
And so, in light of the citizens organizing, and in light of the self-policing infrastructure, and in light also of the weaponization of some of our identities, what would you say is the role then of Uganda's accountability institutions for equal opportunity, rule of law, democracy, among other things, in the context of militarization?
That question presupposes that these institutions are there and they are free. I think that I would say categorically those institutions are either they are there but not free, or they are themselves a part of the infrastructure for self-policing. So you look at the kinds of institutions we are talking about. So you're talking about the parliament. In Uganda, Uganda's parliament is really like a peripheral institution because all power has been concentrated in the president. The president can determine what parliament should do and what it should not do. The judiciary. This is one accountability institution which is supposed to adjudicate between citizens, but also between citizens and the state whenever there is a conflict. But you see, where you have a president who has been in power for now close to 40 years, it means that that president has appointed every judicial officer in the country. And normally the appointments are a vehicle for which you can be able to have alternative voices and views within a particular institution. So if I have appointed all the judges and magistrates, it means that there is a certain character of these judges and magistrates that I'm looking for. And if I have appointed all of them, probably you have a monolithic thinking. But also these judges and magistrates probably know that their tenure is more dependent on the appointing authority than the institutions that are in place to ensure independence of the judiciary. And you've seen now the practice like in the judiciary where increasingly judges are appointed in acting capacity. All that is a part of the militarization because we can be able to, you have to create uncertainty for you to be able to derive certain benefits that you need for the regime. You can think of institutions like the Inspector General of Government. That's a very powerful institution where if you as a citizen you were aggrieved, you go to that institution. But I don't think that in this country anybody believes that the IGG as an institution is any institution that adds value. We know the history of the leader of the head of the institution, whose basically character and persona is questionable because of the background the political background that she has come from. You can say that for many other institutions, the Uganda Human Rights Commission. I mean, if you listen to the chairman of the Uganda Human Rights Commission today, you can say this is someone who is definitely deficient in terms of qualifications of heading a human rights commission, which is a very serious accountability institution in as far as respect for human rights is concerned. Then the other institutions like the Equal Opportunities Commission and many others that really they are peripheral. For an ordinary Ugandan, these institutions, their presence or absence doesn't change anything. In other words, today, you can close the Equal Opportunities Commission and a Ugandan somewhere in Karamoja or in Acholi or Bunyoro will never even know that this institution has closed. So all these accountability institutions are victims of the militarization that you will see. And in most cases, you have seen that actually there are more military people being appointed in these institutions as well. So that's why you are seeing an increased military presence in the public service. So if you go to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the two ministers are military generals. The permanent secretary is a general. The head of immigration is a general. One can give them credit. These are Ugandans also who have also a right to serve their country. But the moment you have a fusion of the military and the public service, basically you've reached the point where you say, oh, this is now militarization. You go to the Ministry of Agriculture, you find the permanent secretary is a general. The Minister of State for Agriculture is a general. I mean, it's like, how is it possible that you can have institutions, the civil institutions, headed by army officers or police officers, and then you say it is normal? Definitely something abnormal. Even if these officers were to be able to go there and work and be efficient, it means that elsewhere the society has been completely decimated because it has no capacity to be able to survive on its own without being controlled by the military.
Indeed. And talking about the society itself, and the citizens' formations, I know you had a rather skeptical outlook on the citizen formations themselves. But in your own observations, what have you not observed any form of mobilizing, any form of sort of pushback? For instance, when we talk about the youth movement, especially if you align it with the political formations, the likes of the National Unity Platform and the People Power movements, isn't there something to be said about some sort of citizen awareness or attempt to actually respond either through resistance or through acceptance or co-optation to this phenomena of militarization?
I think that there is continuous resistance, and I think that's the silver lining that gives you hope that this whole process of militarization can be resisted. So there is continuous resistance, but continuous resistance in a situation where society is militarized, there is also continuous demobilization. So if you think of the young people, the youth movement, I mean the many young people have been mobilized around political formations, including NUP. But you see the level of violence that has been unleashed on these young people, being executed on the streets, being kidnapped and detained, and some of them killed. So you can see that it's a very systematic and coordinated attack on this segment of the population. So you have the attack on the anti-regime youth movements. And then on the regime side, it's also mobilizing. So when you see Museveni's son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is also a military general, a serving military officer, being promoted there, that he's president, breaking the law, violating the constitution consistently and openly, and saying he represents young people. That is part of. So you mobilize as you demobilize. And I think that's really clearly evident across the board. So, in short, there is continuous resistance. There is continuous organizing. There are young people who are trying to organize in different economic formations in spite of the difficulties, because I can assure you that it's difficult. The conditions, the environment in which we are living now is fairly difficult to organize, because we are talking of a country where over 40% of the population are basically either live below the poverty line or in situations which we call conditions of perpetual vulnerability. So every one out of every 100 people, 40 of them, either they live below the poverty line, that's less than $1 a day, or if it was a household that has a very small problem, it could be a health ailment, it could be a pandemic like we had COVID, it could be a death in the family, those people can simply go below the poverty line. So in those conditions, when you combine it with the fear that has been generated by the excessive militarization of society, you've basically created conditions that make organizing very difficult in terms of how do you organize. And on this side, you are being given free goods, you are being given patronage schemes like PDM and Youth Rival Program and whatever. So there is the mobilization, but there's also the demobilization. And finding the common ground is probably the biggest challenge that we have, where Ugandans can understand that militarization does not benefit anybody, that with excessive militarization, we all become prisoners in our own country, where you have a president who is like the commissioner of prisons, and these segments, the military, the police, the intelligence, they basically operate like prison warders, because everybody is almost a prisoner.
Okay. It's quite a grim outlook over there, but nevertheless, we have to, I guess, remain a bit optimistic.
Why do you have to remain optimistic? You have to find the reasons for being optimistic, because I think, Sylvie, this is always, I always find this strange with Africans. They describe their situation and look at the uncertainty of the future, and they said, but we still have to remain hopeful.
Yes, because that becomes then the basis for, future organizing. Otherwise, there is no hope.
That's also not true.
Okay. So then, having said all that we have said about militarization, does the army, in any case, have a role to play within the civic space in Uganda?
Yeah, it's the character of the army that matters. The character of the army. Is this a national army? If it's a national army, then it operates more from the concept of militarism, because it's an army that is building its capability to be able to protect the interests of a country, but also to project power that becomes the more or less like the projection of a country's foreign policy. So the army has a big role to play, but it's the character of that army matters. In our case, I think we have had we've had a situation where most of the armies that we have had at every one moment, they have had their own inherent problems. Also, this was a colonial army. This is a post-colonial army, so its basically character remains tied to the colonialism. After the overthrow of Idi Amin, you have the Uganda National Liberation Army. It's an army of different fighting groups that was crafted during the Mosh Conference. These guys came with their different interests, so they become our national army. You have that army operates under Milton Obote, and in 1985 it is overthrown by the NRA. That's the National Resistance Army, which was a rebel group of President Museveni. And all we have had is an attempt to try to transform what was a rebel army into a national army that we now call the UPDF, the Uganda People's Defense Forces, under the Constitution. That army there has been some substantial progress in trying to reorganize that army into a national army. I think the President Museveni has been very instrumental, if one was to give him credit, the fact that he has created the kind of environment where you have professionals, highly educated young men and women join the military. I think that's a very big credit that one would have to give him. But as I have argued time and again, until that army can salute another commander-in-chief who is not its rebel leader, you can't say that transformation has ended, because the character of the UPDF is that while it has increasingly been professionalized, we have many of its elements, its officers that have been very, very active in our national political psyche, in our basically subverting the electoral process. Most of the subversion of the electoral process is always perpetuated by elements within the UPDF. You've had even senior army officers come out publicly to say, we will not support anybody who is not President Museveni. You've had senior military officers who come out and say, we can't salute Besje or Chagulanyi or whatever. Those are the inherent structural problems that you have within the military. So in other words, for the army to play a positive role in civic organizing, in civic expression, all that is dependent on the character of the army, and we are far from having that kind of army. I think if I was to give an example from my own assessment, because I follow military matters very, very closely, I've been arguing that the mere fact that in 2023, that's almost more than 20 years after the promulgation of the 1995 Constitution, that you can have a senior army officer, a 4-star general, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is Museveni's son, that he can be able to blatantly violate the army laws, blatantly violate the Constitution, and the administration of the army has no capacity to call him to order. And his father, who is the Chief of Defense Forces, who is the Commander-in-Chief, has no capacity to call him to order. It shows you how the UPDF itself is also a victim of the current militarization and dictatorship that we are facing. So the UPDF, while we have already thought that it looks like the only institution that is functional, its weaknesses are now being manifest because of its inability to manage its own internal discipline issues, but also have implications on the overall governance and constitutional dispensation of this country.
Okay. So, having said all that, still again on a skeptical note, what then do you suggest as options to address the issue of militarization and its impact on citizens' agencies and state accountability institutions? Is there any hope?
I would think of like two things that need to be done, and me, I don't normally look for the silver lining, where you are struggling to look for hope. because it's hope should be founded on certain empirical facts. So this is my hope. My hope is that, first of all, let me say that the situation we are in, our society has been so deeply militarized. The security actors, the security officers, and the security institutions have literally almost captured most of the institutions of citizenship, either taking them over literally or perpetuating the kind of fear that creates self-censorship among every segment of our society. So, having said that, then my view is that Uganda is at a point where you are not going to move beyond this situation by say, we have organized an election and someone has won and therefore we are changing. I believe that going into the future requires Ugandans from all these segments to be able to sit on the table and talk together. And that's what I normally call the national dialogue. that we need to create the conditions that enable us to all appreciate that the future of Uganda that we desire as a generation can only be negotiated. So all of us, whether we are different ethnic nationalities, we come from different religious backgrounds, we come from different political parties, we come from different professions, different economic professions. We all have to acknowledge that we are at a point where we need to talk to each other to be able to negotiate the future. That future must entail how to create guarantees for President Museveni and his family, some of those generals within the military, to make sure that you are not creating another future where there is going to be retribution. No, you basically want to move on. And I think so. A national dialogue for me is like the platform where we now renegotiate how we relate to each other and how we govern ourselves. Because the minimum consensus that was formulated and adopted in the form of the 1995 Constitution has literally collapsed. So related to that is then the question of citizen organizing. That as citizens, we have to acknowledge that at an individual level, there is so much you can do, but there is a lot that you can't do individually. And in fact, in citizens in their individual capacities, they are vulnerable to abuse, to attack, to oppression. So we have to acknowledge that collective citizen organizing is our main tool to be able to demand that we have to have this conversation. I think that's how, for me, I combine this. And when I talk about citizen organizing, I'm even talking about the guys who claim to be NRM, assuming they understand what NRM is. I'm talking about the people in the military, because these are Ugandans who have been given the honor to serve this country and put on our military uniform as a country. Many of them are as much of victims, even when we think that they have been used to militarize society. Many of these military officers and men and women, they are as much of victims as any one of us. So when I talk about collective citizen organizing and being able to sit and talk to each other, basically I mean almost each and every Ugandan in their different individual personalities, but also in their different citizen formations.
Okay, that's actually an optimistic note on which to end. So you and I are both hopeful people.
Yeah.
And we have now come to the end of our episode on reimagining Uganda's future in the era of militarization. We thank Mr. Tumushabe for being our guest, and we hope that this conversation has improved your understanding of the relationship between militarization and militarism, with citizens' agency and state accountability. We invite you to share this episode with your friends and networks. Please look out for our next episode as we dig deeper into the question of militarization in Uganda and beyond. Thank you.
Makerere, Makerere, we build for the future, the great Makerere. Great, great and mighty, the walls around thee. Great, great and mighty, the gates beside thee. Great, great and mighty, the walls around thee. Great, great and mighty, the gates beside thee.